Japan, September 1945. The war was over, but silence still sounded like defeat. Across the cracked concrete of a former military compound in Yokohama, a group of Japanese women stood in worn uniforms, once symbols of discipline, now reminders of surrender. The rising sun stitched to their sleeves had faded under months of dust and hunger. Their faces were expressionless, trained to hide emotion. But their eyes carried the weight of an empire that had vanished. In the distance, an American truck approached, its tires crunching through rubble. Inside sat a group of women in Red Cross armbands, clutching crates marked relief supplies. There were no weapons now, only fabric, shoes, soap, small things that once meant nothing, now everything. When the American women began handing out the clothes, the Japanese officers hesitated. Accepting kindness from the enemy felt unbearable. Then one young officer bowed and broke into tears as an American nurse draped a clean coat over her shoulders. It was the first time in years that a Japanese soldier cried without fear. And it marked the quiet beginning of Japan's rebirth. In the years leading up to that silent morning in 1945, Japan had built a nation where war was not just duty, it was destiny. From the moment the empire rose under the banner of the rising sun, the belief in national sacrifice had seeped into every classroom, every home, every heartbeat. Young girls were taught that their role was to serve the emperor through purity, obedience, and endurance. But as the war deepened, that definition of service changed. By 1943, Japan's armies were stretched thin across the Pacific. Men were dying in the jungles of Burma, the islands of the Solomons, and the burning plains of China. The home front began to hollow, so the government turned to women, not just as caretakers, but as soldiers of the homeland. Tens of thousands of Japanese women entered military service in auxiliary units. The Teishintai, volunteer corps formed to assist in communications, logistics, and nursing. Many became part of the Joshi Teishintai, the Women's Volunteer Labor Corps, which included officers from elite families. They trained in strict military fashion, saluting, marching, reciting oaths of eternal loyalty to the emperor. To them, surrender was worse than death. They wore khaki uniforms stitched by their own hands, their hair bound tightly beneath caps. Every morning began with a salute to the imperial portrait. Every night ended with air raid sirens or the echo of distant bombings. The imperial rescript on education, memorized since childhood, reminded them that to die for the emperor was an honor. To live after defeat, a stain. In 1944, when the tide of war turned, these women were pulled closer to the heart of the collapsing empire. The air raids intensified, cities vanished under firestorms. Tokyo became a sea of ash. Yet even then, female officers were instructed to maintain order, record losses, care for the wounded, and above all, never show weakness. Many of them were stationed in hospitals or supply centers, treating burns, amputations, and starvation with almost nothing to work with. Cotton bandages were reused. Medicines ran out. The smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke and fear. Yet they continued, believing Japan would somehow prevail. By early 1945, the illusion had broken. The homeland was under siege. Okinawa had fallen. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still untouched, but every civilian knew what was coming. The Imperial Army's male officers began preparing the population for a final sacrifice, the Ketsugo Plan, a total defense of Japan to the last breath. Women were trained to fight with bamboo spears. The female auxiliaries were told to destroy records, burn flags, and never fall into enemy hands alive. Then came August. 2 atomic flashes ended centuries of imperial pride in a matter of days. When Emperor Hirohito's voice finally broke through the radio static on August 15, 1945, most of these women collapsed where they stood. The emperor, whom they had been told was divine, had spoken words of surrender. His calm, distant voice told them to endure the unendurable. For female officers, it was unbearable. Some took their own lives out of shame. Others tore off their insignias, burying them in the soil. The uniform that once symbolized sacred duty now carried the mark of defeat. When Allied occupation forces began arriving in September, these women, officers, clerks, nurses, were rounded up, questioned, and processed. Many were detained temporarily in repurposed army facilities. They were not tortured or humiliated by the Americans, but the emotional humiliation came from within. To face the victors in tattered uniforms to be seen as conquered, it shattered something far deeper than pride. Among the occupying forces, there were also American women, Red Cross workers, nurses, and civilian volunteers who had followed the troops into the ruins of Japan. Their mission was not revenge, it was relief. They carried supplies, food, medicine, and clothing. For the first time in history, Japanese military women, who had once sworn never to surrender, stood face to face with women from the nation they had been taught to hate. They did not speak the same language, yet they understood each other perfectly. Both had lived through the chaos men had created. Both had lost brothers, fathers, and homes, but only one side had the strength left to give that meeting between defeated Japanese officers, and the American women who reached out to them would become one of the most quietly powerful human moments of the entire occupation. It was not planned. It was not recorded on film, but it would be remembered in reports and whispered testimonies as the day when enemies shared the most human of acts, compassion. And that moment did not come from victory, but from mercy. By the time the American occupation formally began, Japan was a nation standing in ruins, its cities hollowed, its people hollow-eyed. From the air, Tokyo looked like the surface of the moon. Nearly 40% of the capital had been burned flat by incendiary bombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not cities anymore, only shadows and silence. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce and diseases spread through what remained of the urban districts. The Japanese government, once a machine of imperial certainty, was now a shell under General Douglas MacArthur's command, the supreme commander for the Allied powers. Yet amid this devastation, another kind of battle began. The struggle for dignity. For Japanese women, that struggle was doubly heavy. Many had lost husbands, fathers, and sons. Others, like the female officers of the wartime auxiliaries, were now stripped of rank and status. Their uniforms no longer meant power. They marked them as remnants of a failed ideology. Some were placed in temporary detention centers. Others simply wandered home in silence. The occupation authorities quickly realized Japan's collapse was not just military or economic, it was moral. The people needed food, shelter, and purpose, but they also needed something harder to restore: trust. That task fell partly to a group of unexpected participants, American women. While the U.S. military occupied the islands, organizations like the American Red Cross, the YWCA, and church-based relief agencies began arriving with civilian teams. Many were women, nurses, social workers, and volunteers who had served in Europe or the Pacific. Their mission was humanitarian: to rebuild, to heal, to prevent starvation. They were not trained for what they would face. Everywhere they went, they encountered stares, not of hatred but disbelief. To the Japanese, especially the women, Americans were not people. They were victors from another world. The idea that these same women had come to offer help was incomprehensible. At processing centers in Yokohama, Tokyo, and Nagoya, Japanese female officers and nurses were brought in for identification. Their uniforms were ragged, their faces gaunt from malnutrition. Some still carried the rigid posture of service, refusing to sit before Americans. But beneath the discipline, exhaustion had set in. When American women opened crates of donated clothing, dresses, coats, stockings, scarves, they expected gratitude. Instead, there was hesitation. Many Japanese women refused at first, bowing in shame, unable to accept gifts from those they had been taught were barbarians. To accept mercy from the enemy was to admit humiliation, but slowly that resistance began to soften. The first exchanges were quiet. No speeches, no ceremony. An American nurse would extend a folded coat or a pair of shoes. A Japanese officer would bow low, trembling hands reaching out and sometimes accepting, sometimes turning away in tears. The Red Cross reports describe these moments as deeply moving, though most Americans could not fully grasp the cultural gravity of what was happening. In Japanese society, particularly under the pre-war code of Bushido, to receive charity was to lose face. Yet in that same act lay the possibility of renewal, of shedding the identity of soldier and becoming human again. A few Japanese women later wrote about it in diaries and letters. One entry, translated years later, read, "I could not meet her eyes. She smiled as if she did not know I was her enemy." When she placed the coat around my shoulders, I felt warmth I had not known since childhood. I cried, not for Japan but for being treated as a person again. Such encounters were small in number but vast in meaning. They marked a silent turn in the relationship between occupier and occupied, especially between women. The Americans who came expected to rebuild infrastructure. What they rebuilt instead was something deeper, the idea that compassion could exist after war. In those early months of occupation, acts like this became symbolic of the new policy taking shape under MacArthur's headquarters. The reconstruction of Japan through reform, not revenge. Women would play a central role in that reconstruction. The U.S. administration soon introduced sweeping changes, giving Japanese women the right to vote, to hold office, to work freely, and to receive education without state ideology. The old imperial system that had turned them into obedient instruments of war was being dismantled piece by piece, but none of those reforms carried the same emotional force as that first moment, when one uniformed woman extended kindness to another, and the enemy accepted. It was not written into any treaty. It was not broadcast on radio. Yet for those who witnessed it, that moment of shared tears and trembling hands became the truest beginning of peace. And that fragile bridge, built not from diplomacy, but from empathy, would soon reveal its deeper meaning through the many angles of the story that followed. In the first months of occupation, the world seemed divided between victors and vanquished. Yet when American and Japanese women stood face to face, that illusion cracked. What remained were simply people, tired, hungry, frightened, trying to remember how to be human again. For the American women, many of them nurses or Red Cross volunteers in their 20s, the experience was unlike anything they had seen in Europe. Japan had been the enemy, the unseen force behind Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and countless battles in the Pacific. Yet when they saw the frail women in tattered uniforms, their hatred dissolved into something quieter, sorrow. For the Japanese officers, every instinct resisted emotion. Their military training demanded silence, restraint, and submission to duty. Yet nothing in that training prepared them for kindness. When the Americans began distributing clothing, the Japanese women stood rigid, eyes lowered. It wasn't pride, it was pain. To them, mercy was unbearable because it stripped away the only identity they had left, soldiers of a divine empire. Then one moment, a trembling bow, a hand extended, a coat draped over shaking shoulders, and became a release. Tears came like confession. The Americans wept too. No one needed translation. In that instant, war ceased to exist, replaced by something rawer and infinitely stronger. Recognition. For centuries, Japanese society had built itself upon layers of hierarchy, ritual, and shame. The female officers, products of that culture, had been raised to embody purity, discipline, and quiet strength. Even defeat was supposed to be graceful, but the war had shattered those ideals. When they faced their American counterparts, women who smiled openly, laughed loudly, and met their gaze without fear, they encountered a cultural world completely foreign to them. To the Americans, generosity was moral duty. To the Japanese, it carried the weight of humiliation. Accepting charity meant losing face. Yet these same cultural boundaries made the gesture even more profound. The coat, the shoes, the scarf, these were not just objects. They were symbols of redefinition. When a Japanese officer accepted them, she was not merely accepting help. She was surrendering an identity built on obedience and superiority. For the American women, it was the opposite. They saw the Japanese not as enemies, but as proof that compassion could transcend propaganda. What they didn't know was that their kindness was dismantling something deeper, the myth that the Japanese spirit was untouchable. Within that simple exchange lay the beginning of Japan's cultural reconstruction, a society learning to receive empathy without shame, and to see humility not as defeat but as rebirth. In most war histories, women exist in the margins, nurses, mothers, symbols. Yet here they became the bridge between two shattered nations. The meeting between Japanese officers and American volunteers was more than humanitarian relief. It was the first gendered diplomacy of the post-war world. During the war, both sides had mobilized women differently. In Japan, women were bound by nationalism and sacrifice. In America, by freedom and contribution. Yet both had lost loved ones to the same fire. Both had waited in fear for telegrams that might never come. Both had held dying soldiers in their arms. When they met, it wasn't the meeting of two armies. It was the reunion of two kinds of grief. The Japanese officers, stripped of status, saw in the American women not conquerors but counterparts, people who had endured the same pain but found strength in compassion instead of command. The Americans, in turn, saw the reflection of their own endurance. It was women who softened the edges of the occupation, who reintroduced tenderness into a landscape defined by ruin. They carried no rifles, yet they accomplished what armies could not. They humanized peace. And though their names rarely appeared in official reports, their hands rebuilt more than hospitals and shelters. They rebuilt trust, one garment, one gesture at a time. Each of these human, cultural, and gender threads wove together into something history could not quantify, a moment where empathy crossed the lines that nationalism and ideology had drawn in blood. But there were still deeper layers, psychological, symbolic, and historical, that would give this event its full meaning in the years to come. For most Japanese women officers, the end of the war was not liberation, it was identity collapse. They had lived years under the iron code of duty. Serving an emperor they had been taught was divine. Every thought, gesture, and feeling had been shaped by military conditioning. To show emotion was weakness. To need anything was shame. When the Americans arrived, the illusion shattered. Those once considered the other, the Western invaders, now held food, medicine, and the power to decide life or death. But what broke the hardest wasn't the loss of empire or rank. It was the confrontation with mercy. Mercy exposed fragility. It stripped away uniform and purpose. For the first time, many of these women faced a mirror they could not avoid. A vision of themselves no longer as instruments of empire, but as human beings. Psychologists who later studied post-war Japan described this as moral disorientation, a collapse of the old identity without a new one to replace it. But within that void, kindness found room to grow. The simple act of being clothed again, not in uniform but in civilian dress, allowed many to feel human for the first time in years. The tears that fell that day were not only for defeat, but for release. They cried because they were finally allowed to. Clothing in this story became far more than fabric. It was transformation in its purest form. The Japanese uniform, stiff, brown, utilitarian, had been a symbol of devotion and denial. Every button was a declaration of loyalty, every fold a sign of control. When the war ended, that same uniform became an emblem of failure. Many women officers kept wearing them only because they had nothing else. So when an American nurse handed over a dress or coat, the act became symbolic. To the Japanese women, the civilian clothes represented loss, the final stripping away of the soldier's shell. But once worn, they also carried rebirth. The harsh lines of uniformed identity gave way to soft fabric and warmth, a physical reflection of a deeper truth, that survival was no longer shameful. Reports from occupation archives describe these exchanges in simple language, mid-loathing, distributed to female personnel. But between those bureaucratic lines lived an unspoken symbolism. When a Japanese woman removed her uniform and dressed again as a civilian, she was stepping out of the war itself. The garment became a ritual of unburdening, an unspoken ceremony of peace. And for the American women watching, it was equally profound. They saw transformation not as conquest, but as connection. The coat on a former enemy's shoulders was proof that war could end without vengeance. In that symbolism lay the seed of something larger, reconciliation through humanity, not politics. The occupation of Japan is often remembered through political decrees and constitutional reforms, disarmament, democratization, the Tokyo trials. But history often forgets that beneath those grand changes were moments like this, small, human gestures that shaped the emotional texture of the new Japan. MacArthur's administration understood that the Japanese people, particularly women, would be central to rebuilding a peaceful nation. Through education reforms and women's suffrage, the old structures of obedience began to dissolve. But the groundwork for that transformation wasn't written in legal codes. It was written in experiences like the one in Yokohama. American social workers later described how Japanese women began volunteering in relief programs themselves. They joined sewing circles, orphan care groups, and teaching initiatives. Many of them had once worn uniforms. Now they stitched clothes for war widows and orphans. The compassion they had once received they learned to pass on. By 1946, when Japan held its first democratic elections allowing women to vote, thousands of those same women, once silent soldiers of a fallen empire, stood in long lines outside polling stations, wrapped in American-donated coats. Those garments had outlived their symbolic moment. They had become part of a nation's new skin. And though the reports never mention names, one can imagine that somewhere among them were the same women who had cried that morning in 1945, now walking into a new era with their heads unbowed. The human, cultural, and symbolic layers of that brief encounter all converged into a moment that transcended victory or loss. The compassion shown that day would ripple far beyond that courtyard. In the months that followed, it would inspire policies, reshape gender roles, and alter the moral language of a nation finding its way from ruin to renewal. And in those ripples began the story of Japan's transformation, the true aftermath of surrender. By early 1946, the occupation of Japan had settled into a strange rhythm, part military oversight, part humanitarian revival. Cities still lay in ruins, yet beneath the ash something fragile was beginning to grow. Markets reopened. Schools resumed. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the echo of sirens. But the wounds of defeat ran deeper than rubble. They lived inside the hearts of people who had known only obedience and sacrifice, and it was women on both, Japanese and American, who quietly became the architects of this emotional reconstruction. In Tokyo, Red Cross officers established sewing centers using donated fabric from the United States. Japanese women, many of them former nurses or clerks from the Imperial Army, were invited to work there. Their first task was symbolic: to repair and repurpose old uniforms into civilian clothing for widows and children. Buttons from military tunics became fasteners for school dresses. The same hands that once stitched insignias now mended lives. For the American supervisors, these workshops were part of a larger Hearts and Hands initiative, a belief that practical work could restore dignity faster than sermons or lectures. And they were right. Within months, more than 50 small sewing centers were operating across Japan, each run by a blend of American volunteers and Japanese workers who had once stood on opposite sides of the war. Inside these rooms, something profound happened. Women spoke across language barriers using gestures, laughter, and shared fatigue. The smell of fabric dye replaced the stench of burned cities. For the first time since surrender, Japanese women began to talk freely about hunger, about loss, about their children's futures. One American nurse later wrote in her diary, "They no longer bowed to us. They looked us in the eyes." That shift, from subservience to mutual respect, marked the true beginning of Japan's post-war transformation. It was not driven by generals or politicians, but by small acts of humanity repeated thousands of times. Meanwhile, in Washington and Tokyo, policymakers took notice. Reports from field officers described the remarkable cooperation and discipline of Japanese women in relief work. This led to new programs encouraging female education, public health, and social welfare. Reforms that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. In 1947, Japan's new constitution formally guaranteed equality between men and women, a revolutionary idea for a nation that had once confined women to silence. But in truth, the seeds of that change had already been planted in those sewing rooms and aid stations, where compassion had replaced conquest. For many of the Japanese women who had once served in the military, the transition was painful but transformative. A former communications officer became a teacher in Yokosuka. Another, who had lost her fiancé in the Philippines, trained as a nurse under American supervision. They no longer wore rank or uniform, but they carried something more powerful: the memory of mercy. That memory also reshaped America's view of its former enemy. Photographs from occupation archives began to show not propaganda, but partnership. American and Japanese women working side by side, smiling over fabric tables, distributing food, reading to children. The world saw that peace was possible not through punishment, but through shared labor and shared grief. The Japanese press, once tightly censored, cautiously began publishing human interest stories about these interactions. One headline read, "Former soldiers sew clothes for peace." It was simple, almost poetic, but to a population still struggling with starvation and shame, it meant everything. It told them that survival was no longer just endurance. It was participation. By 1948, as Japan's economy began to stabilize under the Marshall-inspired recovery programs, the legacy of those early humanitarian efforts endured. The women who had once stood in that Yokohama courtyard now had new lives, as teachers, mothers, nurses, and citizens of a reborn nation. Their children would grow up under a democratic flag, learning English in schools built with American aid. The world would later remember Japan's economic miracle, its factories, its cars, its steel and electronics. But behind those numbers was a quieter miracle, one that began not with industry but with empathy. Because peace was not imposed upon Japan. It was woven into it, thread by thread. And though most of those women would never speak publicly about that morning in 1945, the morning they received new clothes and, unknowingly, a new beginning, their silence carried the weight of gratitude and grace. In 1951, when the Treaty of San Francisco formally ended the occupation, many of the American women who had served in Japan returned to visit. They walked through cities that were now alive with light and laughter. Some visited the same compounds where they had once handed out relief supplies. One of them, an elderly nurse named Helen Shaw, was met by a group of Japanese women bearing flowers. Among them was the same officer she had clothed years before. They bowed to each other, not as conqueror and conquered, but as equals. Helen later wrote in her memoir, "It was then I understood what victory truly meant. It was not that we had won a war, and it was that we had learned to forgive." That forgiveness became the foundation upon which the post-war alliance between the United States and Japan was built, one of the most enduring partnerships in modern history. And it all began with something as simple and as profound as a single coat draped over a soldier's shoulders. History often remembers the grand gestures, the treaties signed, the flags raised, the generals saluting beneath floodlights. But the truest moments of peace are quieter. They unfold in silence, between people who once saw each other as enemies and learn, through simple acts, to see each other as human again. The story of the Japanese women officers who cried when American women gave them new clothes is not about surrender or charity. It is about recognition, about dignity restored where none was expected. It reminds us that the greatest transformations in war are not forged by weapons, but by mercy. When the Allied occupation began, Japan was a nation stripped of everything, its cities, its pride, its faith in itself. But it was through small mercies like these that the first threads of recovery were sown: a coat, a bow, a tear. These were the tools that rebuilt trust before governments even knew how to speak it. What those women shared in that muddy courtyard was something beyond language or politics. The Americans came to help rebuild. The Japanese accepted not as conquered subjects but as survivors. And in that shared vulnerability, both sides found something new: the ability to heal together. Decades later, when Japan emerged as one of the world's most peaceful and prosperous nations, few remembered the Red Cross crates or the humble workshops of 1946. Yet their legacy lingered, in the compassion that shaped Japan's social reforms, in the friendship that grew between two former enemies, and in the quiet proof that empathy can endure even after the unthinkable. The uniforms of those women are gone now, their ranks forgotten, their names mostly lost to time. But what remains is the echo of their courage, the courage to accept kindness when it hurt to do so. In every war there comes a moment when victory must give way to humanity. For Japan and America, that moment came not on a battlefield or a treaty table, but in a simple exchange of cloth and compassion, where a defeated soldier learned that peace could begin with a tear.